start out with Augustine. And why is he all the way up at number 3, and what impact did he have on the church? He's born mid-4th century after the Council of Nicaea, so he had nothing to do with that. So he's born in the 70s. He's a college student. And how many of you have ever had children who are college students or are about to be college students? Well, I probably don't have to say a whole lot more. PJ will be a one soon.
He survived his sins.
Stuart will be one soon, so won't be that long for Rachel and Roland. So he's a college student, and he very much subscribes to the sex, drugs, and rock and roll view of many college students. He lives a rather dissolute life, and later he feels bad about it. This is probably the best way to say it. So later, in the late 4th century, he writes his Confessions, which is one of the great books of Western literature, where he talks about the life that he led and apologizes for it and talks about his conversion, etc., etc. 387, he is baptized by St. Ambrose, who of course wasn't a saint at the time. He's baptized by St. Ambrose on Easter. In the 4th century, it would be very common for baptisms to be done. 391, he goes even further and becomes a priest. So the former frat boy now becomes a priest in a Roman Catholic Church. From 396 to 430, this is why we know who he is, he becomes a bishop. The former frat boy becomes a bishop. And he's a bishop of Hippo in modern times. That's also in Algeria. So today we don't think of Algeria as a hotbed of Christian thought and practice, which of course it is not. But back then, it certainly was. Late 4th, early 5th century, Augustine writes several letters and delivers several sermons which outline the rules for monastic life. One of them was a letter to a nunnery, because the nuns had asked, well, so how do we set up a nunnery, a monastery, and how should we live? And so he wrote a letter to them describing it. This collection of writings and sermons would later be known as the Rule of Augustine. And that in of itself would have been enough to put him in the top 25. Maybe not number 3, but it would have been enough to put him in the top 25. Essentially, he was the first person to establish rules for monastic living. And you'll notice he did it even before Benedict. So the two key influences on Western monasticism in terms of its roots and the rules to live by were Augustine and Augustine and Benedict. Then other stuff starts, which he's pretty well known for. In 411, he soundly defeats the Donatists at the Council of Carthage. Boy, I went through that whole thing when we did the course on baptism. I'm not going to go through the whole thing again, other than to say that the Donatists were a schismatic group. They had broken away from the Catholic Church. They started preaching that only Donatist baptisms were valid, and that if you weren't a Donatist, you couldn't be saved. Of course, today we don't have any religious denominations that are like that, and we had stuff like that. And so he soundly defeated them at a church council. Between 413 and 426, he writes what is probably his masterpiece, his most influential work, although college students enjoy the Confessions more because they get tips out of it. But the City of God is his masterwork. It's as close as he gets to writing the theology of Christianity in a single book. Although he wrote hundreds and hundreds of letters and a number of books. 417, 418, he's called again to combat yet another, this isn't so much a schismatic movement, more a heretical one, by an English monk called Pelagius. And this one's a little nearer and dear to my heart, because while I bear Pelagius no ill will, and I understand why Pelagius did what he did, said it was possible for us to live pure lives and not sin because we were basically all, okay. This is before Hitler and Pol Pot and Stalin and the first battle of the Somme and Verdun, of course. But he said it was possible for us to live sinless lives. And, the Pope told him, stop saying this stuff. It's not part of Catholic doctrine. He refused to do it. So it's who is brought into the fray. It's not the Pope who fights against Pelagius. It's, once again, Augustine. So there were a number of theological issues and doctrinal issues that Augustine, throughout his career, was called in to kind of be the adjudicator for. And we'll talk about some more of them after we get done the overview here. He dies in 430 in Hippo. So he lived into the 70s. He becomes a saint at some point. It's not unusual for the early church fathers for us not to know when they became saints. It often was within a year or two after they died. You'll note that John Paul II was recently beatified.
He's being beatified today.
It's today?
Yeah.
Okay. So he's beatified today. A couple years ago, he was made the Venerable John Paul II. That's the title I would personally like after I use around the church here, the Venerable Robert Jones. Then beatification was next, and then on his way to sainthood. But the early church fathers pretty much, while the corpse was still warm, they made him saints, and the dates are not important. And in 1295, he is designated a doctor of the church by Boniface XIII. So he is one of the 33 doctors of the church. Okay, so why is he on our list? Why is Augustine or Augustine? So why is he in here? Well, first off, let's have a little love for the graphic. Ooh. Thank you. He established core church doctrine in many areas. It was at a time, it was early enough in the life of the Christian church that there were still areas there weren't really official doctrines on yet, and people were still arguing about stuff. He got to be the guy who established the doctrines. I would say baptism was one particularly important. Predestination, original sin, not that original sin was an idea new to Augustine. Tertullian had, I think Tertullian was the one who actually gave it the name original sin. And of course Paul in Romans and in other books has the idea of original sin, but he doesn't call it that. And salvation by grace. These are all things that he established as doctrines. Again, I'm not suggesting they were new thoughts that no one had had before, but they became official doctrines in the Catholic Church because Augustine was so influential. He wrote over 100 books and hundreds of letters, many of which we still have. Confessions, an autobiography of his wild younger years, is the most fun one, although he does write it with a certain pious tone of
Well,
disapproval.
it was interesting because you see how he evolved from his wild and thing to, let's tone it down a
He's
little
a
bit.
bishop now.
Yeah, that, how he evolved from sinful ways into, getting his head together. But it was a good book. I enjoyed it.
City of God, we already mentioned, on Christian doctrine. Those are probably his three most famous works, along with the collection of letters and sermons that form the rule of Augustine. Augustine outlined some of the basic precepts of monastic living. His rule would be used during the Middle Ages, especially by the canons. The canons were not things, artillery, but rather these would be monks who generally went around the countryside preaching as opposed to all living all the time in a monastery. The Augustinian or Austin canons was a group that was named after him. And then it's always difficult for me to try to say this, but the Premonstratensian canons, which are actually named after a town in France. And I'm not going to try to say that word again.